The emergency alert on my phone went off with a shrill noise, repeating 3 times and vibrating angrily, just as I was bringing the last of my stuff into the cabin. I took the device out of my pocket and stared at it in disbelief for about a minute before realizing that I'd have to leave, only moments after arriving. My hands were shaking from the cold as I read through it again. Severe weather alert. Heavy snowfall in the Frontenac region is expected to begin tomorrow. 60 to 80 centimeters of precipitation. Not good. I realized the roads would be impassable by this time, the following day. That meant I would have to leave early the next morning to avoid being stuck on the road in the blizzard, but subsequently meant 0 ice fishing time for me. I'd be lucky to make it home before it started coming down in earnest. Moments later, messages started coming in from my 3 friends who had planned to join me. The group chat notification popped up on my phone as I opened it. Matt, did you see the emergency alert about the storm? I guess the trip's off. What a bunch of crap. Ted, OMFG, a generational storm is what they're calling it now. Looks like we'll have to postpone it a few weeks. I hope you didn't go through with your plan to go up a day early, Jay. Greg, no kidding. What are the chances this blizzard hits on our ice fishing weekend? I messaged back saying I understood we'd have to reschedule. I told them that I made the trip up alone, accompanying the message with forehead-slapping emojis. It sucks that I'll be stuck up here alone, I thought to myself. My dog Gibson pawed at my leg, and I smiled at her, feeling slightly reassured by her presence. Yeah, you're right, Gibby. I'm not completely alone. At least I've got you here with me. After putting down a bowl of water and another containing kibble, my next priority was to start a fire in the small brick stove at the center of the main living area. There was wood stacked up in a neat pile next to it, and a small bag containing kindling which we'd brought with us in the summer and left behind. At first glance, it looked like a large enough stack, but I knew from experience I'd need twice as much as it appeared to make to get through the night, so I went outside to gather more from beneath the boathouse. The family cottage was a rustic one, to put it mildly. There's no running water, no electricity, and the cabin's poorly insulated. Perennially procrastinated repairs were needed in more than one place, including the floor beneath one bed which had partially collapsed, letting in slight trickles of cold air from outside. It was drafty, and I could hear the sound of mice which had made their way through the gaps, burrowing in the bedroom and finding their way into our old coats or sleeping bags or something that we'd left behind. I sighed as I lit the kerosene lamps which were scattered on wobbly tables around the main living area. There was something about having vermin in the cottage that set me on edge, but at least Gibson's presence would keep them at a distance. After filling the place with warm, flickering light from a half-dozen kerosene lamps, I felt a little better. There was reassurance in having fire, and I started working on making a big one in the stove that would keep me warm throughout the night. I loosely wadded up some newspaper and then stacked dry kindling on top, making a teepee. Over that, I added larger pieces of wood, until I had piled it to the ceiling of the small stove. Then I lit a strip of cardboard and held it up to the paper inside, catching it alight in several places, watching as it began to burn and then flared up in a bright white-orange glow. Holding my hands up to the fire, I watched it and warmed myself up. Eventually I took off my boots and my coat, the entire cottage getting a little toasty. There's no sense unpacking, I thought, taking a beer out of the cooler and opening it. I took a sip and couldn't help but grimace at the taste. I'd never tried the brand before, and I'd picked it up on recommendation. It was awful, and lukewarm to boot. Par for the course, considering the trip so far. Took out my phone and watched some Netflix while beer went flat beside me. I lifted Gibson up onto the futon with me so that she was off the floor and close to the fire where it was warm. Eventually I got bored of Office reruns and called it a night, adding another log to the fire and reminding myself to wake up in an hour to keep it going. Pulling the futon even closer to the stove so that it was close to the fire as safety would allow, I curled up in my sleeping bag and drifted off into an uncomfortable slumber, constantly tossing and turning, trying to stay warm but not really succeeding. I woke up to the sound of whining coming from Gibson's trembling form on the bed beside me. I was so cold that I was actually scared. My teeth were chattering uncontrollably, and I realized a few hours had passed. The fire had gone out completely, reduced to mere embers at the base of the stove. I put on my jacket and blew hot breath onto my fingers, pulling Gibson closer to me. She was shaking as well. My hands were trembling as I put more newspaper and kindling on the fire, blowing it into embers and hoping they would reignite. My lungs felt frozen, and my heart was beating fast, my skin prickling with pins and needles, turning it into a total numbness in my extremities. I'd never felt so cold in my life. I realized I was far beyond the weather forecast for tomorrow. It seemed like it was minus 30 degrees, and steadily dropping further. Terrified that I wouldn't be able to get my body temperature back up, my mind started racing, thinking of worst-case scenarios. If I couldn't stop shaking pretty soon, it would be impossible to start the fire again. I recalled that my truck was just outside, and I could get in there and start it up, turning on the heat until I felt warm again. The idea of getting out there and the truck refusing to start was too much to take, though. Considering the state of the beat-up old Ford, that seemed like a distinct possibility. So I continued stoking the fire, blowing on the precious few embers and adding more newspaper every so often until the tiny flame had begun to grow. I held my shaking hands up to the measly fire and added pieces of kindling sparingly, one by one, terrified of it going out again. Pulling Gibson closer, we shared each other's warmth, and I began to feel halfway human again. A sound came from outside the cabin suddenly, startling me and causing me to jump. My heart skipped a beat, then pounded faster and faster in my chest. A noise like fingernails being dragged along the siding could be heard from all around. Echoing in the small space, something was going from one end of the cottage to the other, attempting to get inside. Deep, guttural breathing could be heard, grunting and snorting, desperate as it scraped its talons along the boarded-up windows. Gibson began to whine, making high-pitched noises as she huddled closer to me, and I put my hands over her muzzle, muffling her sound. Was it a bear, I wondered? I realized I was holding my breath. I thought about the holes in the flimsy facade of the cabin, the spot beneath the bed where mice were getting in. I thought about the broken screen door and the wooden one behind that which needed to be replaced, almost falling off its rusty hinges. The entire cottage felt so frail and insecure all of a sudden, and I heard the loud noise of whatever that thing was, breathing heavily just outside, trying to get in. Maybe it was too cold out there even for it. The ground shook from the weight of the creature as it made its way around the cabin. I was so focused on it that I didn't notice the fire going out at first as it fizzled down to embers. I continued holding my breath until it was gone. Then I relit the fire, my shaking hands barely able to get it going again. Once it was burning hot, I didn't sleep anymore. I pulled Gibson close, and the two of us stayed up all night, watching the fire with wary eyes, taking occasional glances at the door. Even once we were both warm, we continued to shiver. When the sun came up, I didn't notice at first. It was dark in the cottage one minute, and then it was light. I blinked my eyes a few times and rolled out of bed, deciding I would waste no more time leaving. I was hoping the bear, or whatever had been outside the night before, was gone. Gibson was scratching at the front door, asking to be let outside to pee, which told me it was probably safe. In the light of the morning, all that had happened seemed to be a bad nightmare, and I told myself maybe it had been, till I got outside and saw the claw marks that marked the exterior wall. Shuddering, I threw my belongings in the truck, doused the fire with too much water, and took one last look at the place. What a weekend this had turned out to be, I thought to myself. With more people around, it would be easier to keep the fire going, taking turns feeding it with wood so that everyone could sleep through the night. But it was frightening being up here by myself, even with Gibson by my side. I'd never done it before in the winter, and I never would again. There were too many things that could go wrong. Freak snowstorm, a fallen tree blocking the road, getting stuck or going into a ditch, and those were just the beginning. I wanted to get out of here before any of those things happened. The truck didn't want to start at first. I turned the key in the ignition twice, hearing only the click of the absence of any engine noise. Cursing loudly, I checked to make sure I hadn't left the interior lights on or something which would drain the battery. Satisfied there was still a charge, I tried one more time, and finally the old shitbox let out a cough and kicked into life. The engine began to sputter before finally settling into a steady, rusted purr. "All right, Gibson, let's get out of here," I said, rubbing my dog's head and smiling as she blinked at me. She looked content in the front seat, happy to be back in the truck and out of the cold cottage. There was a thin layer of snow on the gravel road, and the tires moved easily enough. I looked up to see the sky was turning gray above us. A few snowflakes were just beginning to fall. The weather was making an early appearance. I turned on the radio, and sure enough, they said the same thing I was thinking. The storm would be arriving early. By noon, the highways would be a parking lot. Whiteout conditions. Be prepared to be trapped in your car. Have emergency services ready. My anxiety was through the roof as I went around a bend in the road. Hitting the gas, I came to the first big hill and went over it, seeing something strange up ahead as I came over the rise. Whatever it was blocking the road. Massive, brown. The lumpy fur shape got bigger as I pulled up in front of it. The bear, which had been trying to get into my cottage the night before, was dead, lying in the middle of the gravel road and blocking it completely. First, I thought it had frozen to death. I got out of my truck and inspected it and was surprised to find there was a horrible smell coming from the carcass. It was a chemical smell, noxious and unpleasant, like some sort of factory waste. The snow had melted all around the beast, the blood and entrails pooling around the far side. What the hell could have done something like this? Aren't bears at the top of the food chain? Alpha predators? Gibson was by my side, but she didn't venture anywhere near the body. Usually she would have gotten curious, trying to sniff at it or something like that, but she stayed next to me, emitting a low growl. The road was completely blocked, I realized. There was no way out, not unless I could move it. No matter which way I attempted it, the giant body of the dead bear would not budge. It weighed a ton. There were large trees on either side of the road, so close to the driving path. There was only one way out, which was by driving across the frozen lake, and that was way risky. I hadn't been able to test the thickness of the ice yet. It would need to be nearly a foot deep for me to feel comfortable, but there was a clear way on and off the ice if it came down to it. I got back in the truck and threw it in reverse since there was nowhere to turn around. I felt sick to my stomach, nervous with anticipation and fear, uncertain of how things were going to play out. Once back in front of the cottage, I got out of the truck and went down to the ice with my spud. Walking out onto the lake, I cleared a spot with my boot and began to dig. I dug with the sharpened metal rod. Satisfied that I'd found the bottom of the ice, I put the tape measure through the hole, hoping it would be close to a foot. Looking at the tape measure, my heart sank. The ice was barely 7 inches thick, just below the minimum 8 inches where it would be safe to drive a vehicle across. My truck was on the heavy side, and I wouldn't feel comfortable unless it was a full foot thick. I pulled out my phone and checked for a signal, deciding it was time to call someone for help. Who would I call? I wasn't sure, but I knew I couldn't get out of this jam by myself. Of course, I muttered out loud, seeing the signal bars were down to 0, and the words "no service" were printed over the top of the screen. Surely I would have gotten another severe warning alert otherwise, because snow was now being dumped down on me from above, and the sky had turned nearly black with the approaching storm. I typed out a message in the group chat, telling them my situation, hitting send regardless of the lack of signal. I knew from experience that it would go through eventually. I just hoped it would be sooner rather than later. Gibson let out a loud, high-pitched whine, her tone rising in volume as she began to bark. High, persistent yips that were totally unlike her. She backed away, then let out a stream of urine, her hind legs trembling as she did. I looked up from my phone, and saw what she had spotted. Across the lake, something was moving in the trees. I saw fingers wrapping around a tree trunk, too high up, the nails too long and too sharp to be a person. Whatever this giant was, it looked similar to a man, but it was massive. It peered out at me from beneath the boughs of the trees, its head probably 15 feet off the ground. Its skeletal limbs matched the monochromatic tone of the birches on either side of it, a gray, pale white shade. I couldn't distinguish the entire form of it in the shadows, but I could make out its eyes. They reflected back at me, catching the gray light coming through the clouds. And then I saw its mouth spread wider in a grin, teeth dripping blood, and it disappeared back into the darkness. The temperature felt like it had dropped to 30 below again, and I began to shiver involuntarily as I looked down to see Gibson doing the same. There was only one choice, only one place we could go: back to the cabin. It was either that or risk plunging the truck into the frozen lake, attempting to drive across. We were on a small peninsula surrounded by water on all sides. Only one way in and one way out, and that way was blocked by the body of a giant brown bear. I took the dog back inside the cottage and locked the doors, taking uneasy glances outside through the cracks in the boarded-up windows. What the hell was that thing in the forest, I asked myself over and over again, but no answers came to mind. There were no creatures I could think of that were 15 feet tall, with reflective eyes that stood on two legs like a man, capable of disemboweling a full-grown brown bear, capable of causing the temperature to plunge all around me. There was only one creature capable of that, and it wasn't supposed to exist. It was something from myth, from folklore, from legends that weren't supposed to be real. "It's a Wendigo," I said out loud, immediately regretting the words, as if saying them made them true, as if saying them would summon it. Wendigos are supernatural creatures born of Canadian First Nation folklore. They live in cold, remote places and make people go mad merely through their presence. They thrive on hunger, despair, and loneliness of their victims, who usually live in remote communities. They drive families apart, instilling urges of cannibalism in people and making them want to consume their loved ones. During the lean, hard months of the winter, this usually happens. They turn people into raving cannibals, driving away all their loved ones, and then once they're alone, the Wendigo strikes. It either consumes you while you're still alive, tearing flesh from your bones while you beg and scream, or it turns you into one of its own kind. But the Wendigo's greatest curse is that no matter how much flesh it consumes, it only grows hungrier. With every ounce of meat it takes in, it grows taller and more emaciated. Its hunger grows more insatiable with its height, until it's a towering beast with its head amongst the treetops as it roams the forest, constantly searching for its next meal. Gibson whimpered and burrowed her face into my armpit as if hearing my inner thoughts. Trying to reassure her, I stroked her fur and told her it'd be okay, although I had a feeling it wouldn't. I tried to get the fire going again, but it was a fruitless effort. Everything inside the stove was damp and wet, and scolded myself for dousing the fire with so much water. Still, I kept at it, knowing we might be stuck here for a while. Pretty soon the wind was howling and blowing outside, and the snow was piling up in front of the door. I made a point of opening it every so often to clear the snow from the steps, knowing that I would need firewood, taking weary glances off into the forest across the lake as I did so. Finally, I got the fire started, a low guttering flame in the stove, which wanted to go out all the time. Everything was damp, but I kept feeding it fresh kindling, nursing it, until it was able to keep going by itself. Hours passed as we waited to either run out of firewood or be attacked by the creature. We were running low on kindling and the sun was beginning to set. My stomach rumbled with hunger when I felt something strange. The ground suddenly shook beneath my feet, and I heard Gibson whining from beside me. "What is it, girl?" I asked, my voice catching in my throat as I realized the answer. It was the creature. It was back. The dining room table began to rattle and bounce up and down as whatever was outside got closer, and I imagined the creature lifting the roof off a cabin like a top on a dish in a fancy restaurant, picking me up and eating me whole like a wriggling shrimp. A second later, there was a sound at the front door, metal being ripped and sheared as I realized the creature was making its way in. The screen door landed on the ground with a crash, and then the wooden door was being torn from its hinges an instant later. Cold air rushed inside as Gibson began to let out shrill, panicked barks of terror. I heard the thing tearing apart the front entrance, easily ripping apart the wood and making the doorway larger so that it could come inside. I tipped over the dining room table to use as a barricade. I picked up a chair, the only weapon I could find nearby, thinking I could throw it at the thing's face to defend us, when I heard a strange noise from the front. It was a car horn honking. Someone had come to save me. I heard a loud ding and pulled out my phone and saw the green check mark beside my group chat, indicating that at some point it had gone through, at some brief moment when there'd been a gap in the clouds. Reading the new messages brought a hopeful smile across my face. "Matt, you just had to skip town a day early and go ice fishing, didn't you?" "What the hell is that thing?" Ted was yelling from outside. "I don't know, but it's trying to get inside. Jay, are you there?" I shouted back that I was. There was a loud screech from outside, which I realized had come from the monster. They'd actually wounded it somehow. I ran to the front door with Gibson and looked out, seeing the creature for the first time. It stood with its back to us, its head among the treetops, even taller than it appeared at first. My friends had caught it off guard, but now it was fully aware of them, and it was going after them. The Wendigo was distracted by something in front of the cottage, and I realized that one of my friends had gotten out of the car and they were using themselves as bait so that I could flee the cottage safely. They had driven across the ice with their lighter vehicle, just as I had hoped to do. I guessed that they'd run into trouble moving the body of the giant bear which blocked the road. "Jay!" Ted screamed out the window, driving the car in a circle on the ice, as if too terrified to stay still. I raced over to the car, slipping and sliding on the ice. It was Matt who was distracting the Wendigo, I realized, and I called for him to get away from the thing. It was too large, too fast. He didn't know what he was dealing with, but that was Matt. He was always act first and think later kind of guy. Not only that, but he often put himself in harm's way for his friends. He turned to look at me and gave a thumbs up, his attention diverted from the creature for a split second. As Gibson and I got into the car, we heard his scream. I looked up to see the Wendigo, close the distance in an instant, and was picking him up like an insect, turning him over and beginning to bite him. As Matt screamed for help, the creature peeled off his skin, exposed his skull as it ate his face. The calls for help turned to bubbling gurgles and wet, choking sounds, and I nearly got out of the car to run after him, but Ted grabbed my wrist and pulled me back inside. "You can't save him," he said with wet-rimmed eyes, and eventually I relented. We raced our way across the icy lake, making a path through the blizzard, cutting a swath off the fresh-fallen snow on our way back to mainland. For a while, we debated what to do. Should we call the police? Our friend had just died, after all, but we knew that if we did, we'd be considered suspects. And with no other reasonable explanation, they'd pin his death on us. They'd say we'd killed him. There were no boxes they could check on an official police report citing a Wendigo attack. So, since such things didn't exist, being myths and legends, we'd be their only suspect. As it turned out, we didn't have to worry about it, though. A message popped up from Matt on the group chat just a few minutes after we got home, and I had to tell myself that it wasn't all just a nightmare, a hallucination from the cold and lack of sleep and food. But Ted and Greg both told me I hadn't imagined it. What we saw was real, as much as I wish it wasn't. The three of us read the message on the group chat again and again. My heart was beating fast, and a sick knot was growing in my stomach, bile rising in my throat that I could taste inside my mouth. "Hey guys, you really missed out on a feast. Ice fishing is just as much fun in a blizzard, if not more so. Let's reschedule the trip for next week, okay? I'll be waiting for you here. As much as we didn't want to go, we've resolved that we have to. We can't leave Matt like that. We have to help him. Next week, we're making the trip back up there. Even if it kills us. Things have been tough since Mom passed. Dad's a complete shell of himself, and I've been left on my own to sort through the abundance of emotions I've been going through. It was actually a relief when Dad told me he was going to head to the cabin for a week. "Can you watch the place for me, Jared?" he asked. Yeah, I had to watch the house, but that was no big deal. It's a 2-story with an AC, stocked fridge, big screen, and a hot tub. It's not like it's a struggle, although the place does still have the landline for some reason. Before he left, Dad told me reception would be spotty at the cabin, per usual. If I really needed anything, I should call between 9 and 11 when he'd be out at the local bar. I told him not to worry about it, and I highly doubted I'd need him. If I couldn't reach him, I'd call Terry next door if I needed anything. Well, it didn't take long before I needed him. I was soaking in the hot tub when the lights on the back porch turned on. The lights back there are motion sensor. Silly me, I forgot to set the security system. What was the code again? As things stood, the alarm wouldn't go off if someone broke in. Thankfully, that animal or whatever it was had triggered the motion sensor, and it reminded me to do it. I'll call Dad and ask him the code. It was getting close to 11, so if I wanted to catch Dad, I needed to call him quick. My finger scrolled through until I found his name in the contacts. I hit call and it began to ring. Suddenly, the landline did as well. The landline read Jared's cell. I looked back at my cell. I've dialed Dad home, not Dad's cell. Jeez, silly me. I moved my finger to the red phone icon, but before I could pick it up, the landline stopped ringing. I hadn't hung up yet. Had it gone to voicemail? Confused, I raised my cell to my ear. No voicemail, only silence. Actually, I think I heard something. Is that static or was that breathing? What the hell? My heart was pounding. I immediately hung up the phone. What the heck was going on here? Taking a deep breath, my heart rate began to slow. There was no way I heard breathing. That would be ridiculous. Had to be a phone malfunction or something. I exhaled deeply and then began to laugh. What a way to start off a week alone, right? My cell began to ring. The ring caused my body to flinch. Clearly I was still a little jittery. Who would be calling me at this hour? Looking at the phone, the call was from Dad home. My eyes widened. The phone continued to ring in my hand. In a panic, I hit decline. The backyard was illuminated by light once again. This was all happening so fast. Before I could react to the lights, my phone started ringing. Dad home was calling. Tears began to well in my eyes, and I hit answer. Hello? I asked. There was no verbal response, but there was something. A slow inhale, followed by a slow exhale. My chest tightened. Hello? Hello? I repeated to myself. More breathing in return. Keeping the phone to my ear, I began moving towards the kitchen. Once there, I grabbed a large kitchen knife. I ducked behind the island, and the breathing on the other end ceased. I peeked my head out to survey my surroundings. The open and spacious nature of Dad's home came in handy here. The kitchen was about 15 by 15, with the island directly in the center and at the edge of the house. Peeking around the corner allowed me to see the entirety of the living room. It was a large, wide space directly in front of me. I leaned to the other side of the island to peek in the other direction. There were doors to the theater room, bathroom, and office. Down a little further was a little opening to the left. If you went in there, you'd see the front door and both flights of stairs. The office had 2 ways to get in, one directly visible from the kitchen, and one around the corner in that opening. There were 4 landlines in the house, one in the kitchen, one in the office, one upstairs, and one in the basement. Ruling out the kitchen meant that this person was in one of 3 places. I sat behind the island, my body wouldn't stop shaking. I set down the phone and held the knife in both hands. If someone were here and coming for me, I was going to need more than a knife. I knew Dad kept a gun in the office safe, and I peeked around the corner again. The theater room, the bathroom, and the office door were all slightly creaked open. If I was going to protect myself, I needed to risk it. I inhaled deeply. As soon as I began to exhale, I shot to my feet and tiptoed for the office. Each step creaked slightly, and it was the only sound I could discern. Reaching the door, I wanted to pause for fear of what may be inside. I pointed the knife into the crease with my clammy hands and gently opened the door. The only light in the room came from the opening. Gently, I closed the door behind me and left it cracked slightly open as it was before. Crawling under Dad's desk, I reached for his safe. It wasn't there. Why wasn't it there? Where could it be? Ah, crap. Before he left, Dad had told me he'd moved his safe to the basement. The walkout basement, with a door I'm almost certain I forgot to lock. Also where another one of the landlines was. Then I heard movement. Someone was here. I sat on the knife so the light wouldn't reflect and curled into a ball. Outside the office, I could hear a fair amount of footsteps. Then the sound of a door swinging open. That was the theater room. Moments later, I heard a thud. Another door was flung open, this one closer. The bathroom. That was followed by another thud. That meant the office was next. Do I keep hiding, or do I make a run for it? I decided to run. As the sound neared the door and grew in intensity, I shot through the open door and exited the office, ducking around the corner. The other door to the office opened, then there was silence. I held my breath, waiting for something, anything to happen. Seconds passed. Everything was still. Please, 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 slam the door so I can run. Still no sound. I could feel the little beads of sweat run down my forehead. Finally, I heard the other door slam shut, and I used the noise to disguise me running upstairs. Knowing where the intruder was had lessened my apprehension of going downstairs. I maintained quiet feet, but quickly maneuvered down the steps. As I reached the bottom, I saw that the walkout door was wide open. I didn't have time to worry about any of that. Darting towards the back, I found the safe and punched in the code. Wrong code, the safe beeped. I heard movement upstairs. You have to be kidding me. What was the code? I punched it in again. Wrong code. I could hear some sound upstairs. Whoever was up there was being much louder than they had been before. Frantically, I put the code in one more time. If it didn't work, I'd have to make a run for it. The safe door swung open. I grabbed the gun and hid. While hiding, I turned the safety off, then checked to see if it was loaded. Thankfully, it was. The creaking of floorboards could be heard overhead. Each sound grew nearer and nearer to the top of the stairs. I closed my eyes and tried to focus, steadying the gun. I aimed where the intruder would be and put the line of sight on the stairs. The sounds grew increasingly louder. A figure appeared at the top of the stairs. Even in the dark, I could make out his all-black outfit and ski mask. One arm was raised, and it looked like he was casually massaging his neck. The figure hobbled awkwardly, each step looking more off-balance than the last. I waited until they reached the easiest spot for me to aim, and I fired the gun. A brief moment passed, and then the body came tumbling down the remaining stairs. Flicking on the lights, I kept my distance, gun pointed at the intruder. Red stains soaked the area beneath the man's body. Kicking at him a few times, there was no reaction from the limp form. Curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to flip him over. He was bleeding immensely from the neck. Removing the ski mask, I immediately became confused. The person was a complete stranger to me. Why would they break into my house? What was the purpose of doing this? What was the wound on his neck from? I'd fired the gun at the man, yet the wound wasn't a bullet hole. It looked like a slash. Looking over to the stairs, there was a hole in the wall. Had I missed? Then how did... It was then that the landline began to ring. It said, Jared's cell. I hadn't seen Mike in a few months. He'd been buried in work, and our usual weekend nights out had all but disappeared. Then he called me on a Thursday and invited me over for drinks. I jumped at the invite, but I took note of how depressed he sounded on the phone. By the time I got there, Mike had already started drinking and was slurring his words pretty badly. A dark cloud seemed to hover over him, which got worse when he drank. I finally asked what had been going on with him, and Mike turned even darker. Afraid, he said it had to do with work. I never really knew what Mike did for a living. I did know that he worked for the city in the tech department, and was involved in the CCTV surveillance network, but I never knew what his day-to-day was like, which he began to describe in detail. Mike explained that there were thousands of cameras scattered throughout the downtown area, the outlying neighborhoods, as well as in the suburbs of our million-plus people city. His responsibility was to categorize and archive all the incoming footage. Most of the footage went into a very general classification and was saved to a hard drive and identified with a lengthy combination of numbers and letters for categorically archiving them. They were truly meant to be forgotten about. It was a pretty expansive task, but Mike had designed and built an AI screening program that detected common patterns in footage, which selected out anomalous behaviors for later scrutiny. He said the vast majority wasn't even noteworthy. Something like 99.9% was just trash. Then, of course, there was the 0.1%. The car accidents, the assaults, the swarmings, the abductions, the murders, those went into a special archive for use in criminal investigations. And then there was the even more exclusive 0.001%. These were held in a classification archive that contained footage of captured events that were, from all accounts, unexplainable. This was called the Tartarus Archive. I looked up the word Tartarus after and discovered that it was one of the darkest, deepest prisons in Greek mythology. It was said that if you dropped an anvil from heaven, it would take 7 days for it to reach the earth. It would take another 7 days for the anvil to reach Tartarus. It was the place they had put the Titans when they had found that nowhere else could contain them. As it turned out, the name was quite fitting for the archives. Some of the footage could be simplified to strange optical anomalies in the camera, and coincidences of light, or a crackhead on a bender going through the subway system. Other footage defied logic. The others are what captured Mike's mind that evening. He'd been breaking protocol and bringing hard drives home at night. In fact, he'd been splicing the footage together, capturing and compiling repeat aberrations, and editing them into a linear sequence. Mike wanted to show me some. It wasn't in a bragging or showing off kind of way either. It felt more like the sharing of a heavy burden. I asked if showing me would get him in trouble, but he waved the idea away. I said, yeah, obviously I want to see what's going on in the city. Mike led me into his workroom. There was a monitor and a tower and a pile of externals set up. We sat down and he skimmed through some drives nervously. Then he landed on one. Mike told me this anomaly was codenamed Lincoln Spectre. He pressed play. On the large screen, black and white footage started up, showing me Lincoln Avenue, one of our less active downtown streets, at 3 a.m. The camera angle showed me the length of Lincoln Avenue as it led into the downtown core. The street appeared to be empty and quiet. From a side road, a woman emerged, walking towards the camera. As she approached the intersection, she turned over her shoulder and appeared to scream. The woman took off, spreading past the camera, which cut to a new, wide angle from another camera across the street. We watched the woman running frantically, seeming to be chased, but she was the only one on the street. There was no one else anywhere near her. The woman kept screaming as she ran, and the camera kept following, cutting between different CCTV angles. We watched as the woman was chased in the middle of an empty intersection. She fell then, cowering as if something massive was standing over her. The woman's neck stiffened, and she began to levitate off the ground suddenly. Her body looked like a rag doll as something lifted her by the throat until she was floating a dozen feet above the road, in the middle of the intersection. Then the woman's head snapped to the left, and her body fell back to the ground. The video ended and went black. I was shocked. Mike saw my expression and said, "You ain't seen nothing yet." I asked if what I had seen was real, if that was unaltered raw footage. And Mike said that all he had done was put the clips together. Hell, none of the content had been touched. He told me the accident ended up being written up as a hit and run, and the case was left figuratively open for more evidence to amass, which it never would. The department kept footage hidden, claiming it was a camera malfunction. No one outside of Mike and his boss had seen the video, and how the poor woman had actually died. I started to understand the air of sombrance Mike was carrying around. Mike started the next video. This one was codenamed Black Crab, and was much longer than the previous one. It started in the subway system, at the underground Walkley station, shortly after closing up for the night. Walkley was the last stop on the route, and the exterior was shouldered by a new housing development on one side, and an untouched forest and swampland on the other. The camera was pointed down along the subway platform on the east side, and it showed its entire length with benches and garbage cans populating it. At the far end of the tunnel, there was only darkness. The lights on the platform shut off and the station went black. The camera switched to night vision and everything became more visible. My eyes trained on the platform, waiting for something to happen. Finally, there was movement. It was coming from the tunnel. It was difficult to identify what exactly it was at first, since the movements were strange and the footage was grainy. But it got closer to the camera, and I got a better look. It resembled a human, a man, but he was walking on his hands and feet, upside down, with his back arched and his stomach pointing to the ceiling. He had long dark hair that dragged along the ground, and he wore the tattered layers of an old jacket and torn pants. He moved like a crab, jerkily yet quickly, and despite his posture, he made his way easily up the stairs. The footage cut to a new camera in the dark hallway leading to the stairs out of the station. We watched the crab walker claw up 2 steps at a time, and then crawl over the turnstile and towards the exit. The footage cut again, now showing the exterior of the train station. The crab walker squeezed and twisted and maneuvered his body through the locked and closed entrance. It looked impossible to accomplish, but he managed it. Once outside, the crab walker eyed his surroundings before skittering off towards the woods and disappearing. The footage cut to an hour later and revealed the crab walker reappearing from the woods. He was dragging a small animal by the tail in his teeth. It looked like a cat. The crab walker squeezed back through the gate, crawled through the station, and disappeared into the tunnel again. Mike saw my expression and told me that there was more. He showed me the length of the video, which was over an hour. Mike had compiled over 20 sequences of the crab walker creeping out of the subway station and into the woods. Mike skimmed through the videos towards the end, and we watched the crab walker coming out of a sewer in the downtown alleyway. It crawled over to a pile of garbage bags and cardboard boxes. Then it jumped onto them, and some kind of vicious frenzy ensued. There was someone else in the pile of garbage. Hands and feet thrashed about as they were struggling for their life. Then the movement stopped, and the hands and feet went still. The crab walker's body moved jerkily about, but I couldn't see what was happening because of the darkness and all the garbage bags and boxes obscuring the camera view. Mike leaned over to me and whispered that the crab walker was eating a homeless man. This caused a criminal investigation as the dead body was found mutilated and festering in the open alleyway. Mike followed up on the inquiry. What he discovered was the crab walker, who authorities believed to be a man named David Fletcher. Decades ago, David had been a prominent lawyer with a family. One Christmas, there was a huge fire, and his wife and kids were killed in the blaze. It was David's fault. He had lost everything, including his mind, it seemed. Everyone has a breaking point, whether they know it or not, a place where they've been too far and then snap. David had apparently found his. Family and friends described his descent as nightmarish. David lived on the street, becoming addicted to drugs and tumbling into mental illness. The last anyone knew of him was from 10 years prior. He'd thrown himself in front of a subway at the Walkie station, and no one had heard from him since. It appeared that somehow David had survived the subway hit. His back had broken and healed oddly, causing him to move the way he did. He'd adapted to the new posture and lived in the darkness of the subway for years, finding sustenance from drain water and wild animals that he caught. That was what Mike found out at least, but then he said that was just the answer the investigators gave at Discovery. Who knew where the truth actually lay? Mike said there was always an answer for the videos he found. Whether the answers were true or not, no one knew. But the ones that had become public all needed explanations, however absurd. Either way, David was never found and didn't reappear on the subway footage. Mike plugged in a new hard drive. He poured a fresh drink and told me this was the one that had troubled him. The file was codenamed Cloud Mirror. I wasn't honestly sure I wanted to see it, but before I could object, Mike had pressed play. All the monitors lit up with footage from different intersections downtown on the exact date and time of each other. There were 5 in total. The streets on each of the screens were empty and quiet. No cars, no people. Suddenly, at the exact time in the center of the intersection, a small glow pulsed into existence. It was some kind of orb, roughly the size of a bowling ball. The streetlights around it pulsed with energy waves as the orb grew larger. It grew to the size of a beach ball, then it flashed out. The streetlights went back to normal, and the intersection was as lifeless as it had been before. I asked Mike what had happened. He told me he had gigs of footage of the orb and had watched them repeatedly. He didn't know what they were. At first, they had just started by chance. Mike clicked on the next video, and again, 5 monitors lit up with the strange intersection and time of night, but it was several weeks later. The streetlights glowed and pulsed, and an orb manifested into existence again. It grew to its beach ball size, but then it altered the surface. Something gas-like replaced it, growing outward into a couch-sized cloud of deep gray. One of the cameras was closer, so I got to see the small cloud in detail. It looked like a volcanic eruption wrapping around itself. They were large, constantly morphing blobs that curled around from the glowing center, resembling a mandelbulb fractal as a gaseous-based organism. It was fascinating to see them floating in the middle of the street, so alien to our roads and stoplights and street lamps. Then they began to move. Gliding down empty roads, the cameras cut to different angles, following the clouds on some unknown paths, zigging and zagging into new streets and through alleyways. Then they stopped. The clouds hovered in the center of the intersection. They lowered to ground level, standing straight up like a large coffin. Holding rigid to their shapes, their exteriors continued to shift and mold together like magnets made of smoke. Something on one of the monitors caught my eye. Down the street, people appeared. They'd seen the clouds and were walking towards it. The group looked drunk and fascinated by the floating entities, so much so that they approached it. As they did, the clouds became brighter. The street lamps began to pulse. The group were in some kind of a trance, staring into the morphic blob. One of the group, a guy, stared into it like a zombie, then walked right into the cloud and disappeared. None of the group tried to stop him. Instead, another one followed him in, and another, and another. All 5 members of the group disappeared into the cloud. Then they reappeared, one at a time. The first guy, and then in the order they came in. Only they weren't stumbling or boisterous or drunk now. They were walking upright, using minimal movements. They formed into a perfect 5-person circle for several seconds after quick words, then turned and all went in separate directions. Their strides and arm swings were all sped up to match. Another monitor showed a similar situation with a large group of people, lost in revelry as they marched one after another into the cloud. Each monitor showed the same thing, people entering the clouds and coming back out different. Mike stopped the video. I asked him if he'd shown this to anyone. He said he hadn't, not even to his boss, which was a problem because he had a meeting with his boss in the morning to discuss the missing footage. I asked why he didn't show the footage to his boss. This footage seemed more serious. People were being replaced by something. Mike sighed and put a new video on. The main monitor lit up and showed a new downtown street. The date was from earlier this week, and one of the clouds was floating in the intersection. A middle-aged couple was walking nearby, the husband with a slight limp on his right leg. The couple saw the clouds and were sucked in by their aura. They approached it, eyes wide and mouths open. Both husband and wife entered the cloud and disappeared. After a moment, they reappeared and the husband's limp was magically gone. Mike turned to me and said, "That was my boss and his wife." I remember looking over at Megan and thinking, it's hard to imagine the abyss is just on the other side of her. We had escaped the humid bayous and casual murders of Houston and hightailed it to Colorado. It had become something of an annual tradition, a weed pilgrimage to Mecca in the mountains. Our yearly foray into real wintry cold had always revived the life within us. Even the gorgeous red of her Irish hair seemed to glint brighter in the deafening quiet of the white world. I didn't deserve her. No false humility here. She was truly better than I was, on a cellular level. Megan had been through unimaginable horrors, hellish trials that left traumatic scars she only showed to those lucky enough to bask in her glow. And yet, somehow, it's like she was able to just rebound the cruelty of the world right off of her, sending her own kindness reverberating along with it. The angrier you got, the calmer she grew. Gnash her teeth in a temper tantrum, and she'd find a deeper level of kindness. It wasn't that plastic falsity so many people possess with their feeble masks. It always rang true. Not me. I absorbed every blow the world dealt me. It warped and twisted and blackened me. I was the very definition of rot. But dying flowers still seek out sunshine. And that was Megan. I'm not a good man. Bungling the time had been a far worse mistake than I anticipated. I was winding my crappy Chevy in a constant circle, forever rising on the mountain in the pitch black as the snow cloaked the poor excuse for a road. I just had to push the envelope and have us stay at the top of the damn mountain. I was half stoned and completely terrified, but the feel of Megan's hand on my thigh gave me a boost of confidence. I always kept fighting through the fear, exhaustion, and endless losses for her. One harrowing journey later, I finally exhaled as we crested into the glacial valley atop the mountain. A few dozen missed turns through the endless world later, we'd arrived. The cabin was as picturesque in reality as it had been on the website. It all seemed too good to be true looking back. I should have realized if it smelled like rotting, there's probably a corpse in there somewhere. I was an ardent bargain hunter, but this deal was mind-blowing. I should have been suspicious. The prize, the quality, the nearly barren website with the obscure URL. But I remembered something about gift horses and teeth. What they don't tell you is to watch for the horse flipping the script and kicking you in the teeth. The idyllic scene laid out before us would have sent Robert Frost to his pen, and I had sneakily stocked up on a surprise for Megan at our last grocery stop. I was going to surprise her with my famous potato salad. I love to cook for her, but really any surprise would do. Like springing this trip on her. I always had a surprise for her, for better or worse. Megan squealed at the prospect. After noshing on the gluttonous snack for half an hour, we shared a blunt and put on some ancient country as we danced slowly, alone in the world. Or so we believed. The first crash against the cabin door made me regret being the only Texan to never carry a gun. It was like thunder had hopped on the back of a linebacker and rocketed into the door. The hinges squealed, the small cabin shook, as if rightfully afraid. I was at the window while Megan ducked behind the bed. I saw the covered porch, the clearing for parking, maybe 20 yards along, and the tree line. The dark and the cold corner swallows the world whole and spits it back out without any real light. I felt truly blind. Still, there was no movement. I turned to Megan, just as our eyes caught in mutual confusion. A second smash rocketed against the door, sending small splinters flying. Megan screamed, and that was enough for me. I charged out the door blindly, a moron in love. I screamed some jumble of obscenities, threats, nonsense, an amalgam of fear and anger, emotional stepsisters with an unhealthy attachment. I let myself feel my heavy breath slow, each exhale sending white waves dancing through the air. My right hand slowly unclenched, and the blood drained from my knuckles. Then I saw it. Out of the woods, slowly trotting, was what I thought was a massive wild dog. Terror and logic are not great bunkmates. As it approached, I realized it was a male fox. I had caught a few nighttime drunken glimpses of tiny red foxes in West Texas when I was in college, but they were no bigger than an overfed house cat. This creature towered like a sinister cat and golden dog had been smashed together by some inebriate pagan god of old. Its trot was lackadaisical, as if it were merely out window shopping, but he kept his eyes fixed on me, stopping 5 yards short of my frozen figure. The fox was the size of a Rottweiler, and dropped on its hind legs and cocked its head quizzically. It began a low, short whine and wore a visage that seemed to say, "I don't want to rip you apart, but it wouldn't be that hard." I slowly backed up. When I saw the fox didn't move, and I was close enough, I made a run for it. Luckily, Megan and I were simpatico enough for her to throw the door open, and I slammed in just in time. We both sank to the floor with our backs against the door. The words hadn't even escaped my lips before we were both sent flying by a crash against the portal. Diving behind the bed, we watched as the door cartoonishly stretched with each attack, never giving way, like an unbreakable barrier holding back the night. Between each crash, the fox whines grew louder. "I'm gonna try something," I whispered to Megan. "Pappy, no, no," Megan begged, trying futilely to grab my hand and hold me in place. Somewhere inside, I think she knew I was forever destined to plunge ahead stupidly. Snatching the pot full of the remaining potato salad, I tore the door open and flung the food out. "Here, eat, you little interloper." I thought maybe I'd set it back on its heels, but the fox wandered into view, cocked its head further, and sent chills down my spine. It examined the pot and began voraciously eating. It stopped eating abruptly and bounded off in a blur into the forest, out of sight. We decided to risk the bears and the other denizens of the night, and left the potato salad outside and hunkered down. The slamming stopped. Everything was quiet once more. Megan and I cuddled in bed, her downing some shrooms and blazing through a blunt to calm her nerves, me downing a few beers, both of us debating whether a fox could have done all that. And why didn't the door give? Cuddled under so many warm blankets, we both passed out. I was on my feet at the first crash, though. Peering from the window, I saw the massive fox trotting from the tree line. My jaw nearly dropped as I called a silently sobbing Megan over. I offered some comfort, but something inside me said she had to see what I was seeing, like I was privy to something supernatural, secluded to this fixed point of space and time. I wanted to share it with someone I loved. Megan gasped when she joined me at the window. "He brought his girlfriend. Your potato salad really is that good." There were a few giggles among the tears and sobs. Seeming to almost levitate as she swayed, a vixen half his size followed in tow towards the pot. She shimmered silver light with each lithe sachet. I don't have the words to describe how lovely she was. It hurt to look at her, but I couldn't look away. She was elegant and dainty, but exuded something powerful and ethereal. She didn't need quizzical looks and sighs to make me afraid. We stood safely behind the window, hand in hand, watching the lovers feast on my potato salad. When they were sated, they slowly wandered back to the woods. The male turned back, I swear with a rueful and pitying look on his face. The vixen never did. The door immediately began smashing without cessation, sending a shrieking Megan diving. 100, 1,000, 1,000,000 times louder. with more force and violence than ever before. In my panic, I just stood paralyzed, feeling the blood drain from my face as I tried to understand the horror before me. A beast was flailing and roaring in circles a few feet from the door, 10 feet tall, the head and antlers of a deer adorned with what looked like the skeleton of a bear. Flesh and fur and sinew hung randomly from ribcage, arm, and leg. Long, bony, hooked claws dragged and sparked against the hard earth. The abomination wailed up at the moon. It looked at me with enormous empty black eyes and slammed against the door impossibly fast. Megan was praying, Mary and Joseph and all that gang, and I just rocked back and forth on the floor of what was supposed to be a little slice of paradise. Suddenly, there was silence. I just caught the curved spine of the freakish nightmare slipping into the trees, and I went and comforted a hysterical Megan. Our phones refused to find service, no matter how hard we begged, and being children of the city, we had come ill-prepared. I have no intention of painting myself any calmer. My insides were liquid, and my heart was somewhere in my shoes. I was simply too afraid to make noise. The left leg of my pants felt warm and wet. Embarrassment had begun to set in when the slamming started again. This time it wasn't as hard, but more like a rapid machine gun fire, hitting different spots on the door. Something humanish stood at the tree line. It looked like the naked body of a man, but there was only a bloody, brutal mess where the genitals should be. Stark, naked, wearing the skull of some massive creature, the man was lifting a gnarled stick and screaming nonsense, each word punctuated by a slam against the door. It was only then in the deep dark that I realized what was hitting the door. The porch was littered with the obliterated corpses of starlings, swallows, hawks, 24 other birds I couldn't identify. Each swoosh of the staff, every pagan utterance, sent a kamikaze bird to its doom in rapid succession. Finally, the frenetic casting stopped. Ripping off the skull mask, I could see a bearded man beneath it, his nose and eyes missing, and blood and pus dripping and flowing indiscriminately. Like a petulant child, he leaned forward, put his hands behind him, and screamed, "Hungry!" over and over and over, before swiftly stalking into the woods. I spent the next 30 minutes convincing Megan this was all real, and not the manifestation of a shroom trip gone terribly awry. Honestly, I could hardly convince myself. My attempts were disputed by a slam against the door, a pause for a few seconds, and a similar but smaller one, like someone bouncing 2 different-sized basketballs against the portal. The adrenaline was beginning to burn into me and steal away my energy. I felt like passing out and began only thinking of my own fears. I dragged myself to the window as Megan buried herself under the covers and tried to force the world away. Out of the woods wandered a bear that had to be at least 8 feet tall. Next to him was a woodsman, decked out as though he had started his shift felling lumber 100 years ago. The bear laid in front of the man with a rusted saw. The lumberjack began sawing the bear's head off, meeting no resistance or protestation. When his wicked work was done, he tucked the bear's head under his arm and knelt down. My knees began snapping together like old bones dancing in a 90s kids' Halloween CD as the headless corpse of the bear rose and used its claws to cut through the back of the lumberjack's neck, severing and separating his head. The headless corpses rose in sick unison, sauntering over to the door, and took turns throwing each other's respectable heads against the door. Bang, pause, smaller bang, over and over and over. I rocked and smelled urine and tried not to beg for my mother as I listened to the heads rebounding time and time again against the door. It was only when the equally eerie silence came that I realized Megan was unconscious. I snapped back to reality and prayed to anyone who would listen that she hadn't killed herself. I mostly didn't want to be alone. An Ambien bottle was next to her. I wasn't sure how much she had brought, but it didn't seem like many were missing. She breathed comfortably and snored. I wasn't sure of anything, but I crossed my fingers that she had just taken enough to knock herself out from this hellscape. I didn't wait for the smashing to return. I walked into the frigid air, feeling the piss in my jeans freeze, and called to the tree line. "Who are you? What do you want?" Without warning, at least 50 people, all wearing black robes, various animal skulls for masks, appeared at the edge of the clearing. Some were adorned with antlers. Some were painted in what looked like blood. Some were covered in what looked like mud or shit or both. So many had their robes open, flowing in the wind, revealing mutilated bodies, missing and bloody genitalia, strange symbols of animals in the forest carved on the foreheads and legs. None moved. Among them I caught glimpses of the hulking skeletal creature, the man with the staff, the headless lumberjack, the bear. The only movement and sound was the mournful howl of the wind. Then they came. I was nearly to Amarillo before he spoke. "Wife." "What?" I asked, ensuring I kept a respectful tone. "Not my girlfriend. My wife." "Oh, sorry," I muttered, with as much sincerity as I could muster. My mind was elsewhere. All I could think about was them trotting out of the trees and seeing every sick knee bend and twisted head bow. I remembered seeing him change in the conversation, finding out what they wanted, learning it had to be given. Certain lines, physical, otherwise, in this world cannot be crossed by those who don't belong in it. I remember striking a deal. Fear got the best of me. I'm not a good man. I remember feeling the bile in my stomach rise as I dragged Megan's half-conscious body out of bed, watching her come out of a haze and realize the dark truth, hearing her beg me, profess her love. I remember dragging her out into the clearing and throwing her to them to save myself. I remember watching her body fall and hearing her screams grow quieter as he dragged her deep into the woods, with the whole lot of freaks following behind. What I remember most was the vixen and I being alone, watching a smile grow across her maw, watching her bare teeth and lick them before bounding off into the forest, off to find her acolytes. I got in the car and waited for my dark passenger. "Thanks for your help, Pappy. We needed to set up elsewhere, to expand and grow our special little family, and you've been a peach. We'll have to fetch, as I said, my wife, after she feasts, of course. She needs a new body to inhabit before she travels, one given willingly by a lover. I got mine. Time for my queens." The fox, who was no longer a fox, sighed with contentment. "Oh, by the way, she truly did love your potato salad. Top notch. But I suspect she will prefer your Megan." What can I say to these people? The community center is filled with cigarette smoke. Everyone here sits in a circle of chairs to complain about their bosses, how they get called to come into work even when they're approved for time off, how they get screwed out of holiday bonuses or maternity care and more. I don't say anything when I come here. I sit quietly and listen and think about how I got where I am. When it's my turn to talk, I pass. It's not like I'm going to say these people have it easier than I do. My story started in my sophomore year of college. During that time, I didn't have many options in way of employment. The few people who were willing to work around my classes already had enough workers and weren't hiring. Thankfully, there were plenty of odd jobs listed on the cork board scattered around campus. Most of them didn't pay much and only required a few hours of your time. But the pay was better than nothing, and I'd rather eat ramen every day for a month than nothing at all. Unfortunately, lots of people were in the same boat, so all these jobs were first come, first serve. Eventually, I found one asking for a handyman. I don't know my way around tools, but I was young and dumb enough to justify that with the aid of a good YouTube tutorial, I could easily learn how to install sinks or change the oil in a car. When I arrived for my first day, my initial impression of Professor Borgenson was that he didn't look like any professor I'd ever seen. He was tall, but very thin. His hair was dark, but there was some gray at the temples, making him look older than he was. If I had to guess, he was in his early 30s. He explained that the job was easy, and the first thing I would have to do would be to remind him to eat. I found that a little funny and smiled, but he was serious. He then explained that he often gets lost in his work and forgets little things like that. When he told me the pay, I accepted the job right away. I'd begin every day by brewing his coffee in a pot, which he would serve himself. Thankfully, my classes were close, so this never interfered with my day. I'd do this again between 2 and 4 in the afternoon each day as well. The second time I went to his office, I would call restaurants and either have them deliver to him or pick up something for him to eat. In less than a week, he told me to keep the coffee coming, but he didn't need me to order food every day. After a few months, he started to tell me to do things that made me nervous. First, it was things like grabbing a file from some other office, but would escalate to picking up packages in weird and occasionally terrifying places. Before long, he had me taking chemicals out of the lab without proper paperwork. Each time I approached him about this, he would say that everything was above board, and not to worry about it. When the chem lab treated the chemicals I took as though they were stolen, I went to Borgenson and told him about it, begging him to clear this up. That was when I learned that Borgenson was using this information to blackmail me. As horrible as he wasn't completely unsympathetic to my situation, and agreed to give me my college credits if I kept doing the jobs he asked me to do. I didn't have much of a choice. At this point, he had enough information to get me expelled from school, so I continued to work for him. Besides, who would the police be more likely to believe? Me, or a man who was up for an award in excellence in laboratory science for neurological research? After that, I stole copper wire for him. He required so much that I was working on it for the better part of a month. Sometimes the buildings I stole from were being developed. Other times it was someone's house who happened to be gone for the holidays. I tried to ask him what kind of experiments he was working on, but everything I asked, he would fly into a fit of rage and frustration, complaining about how hard the work he was doing really was, and that he didn't have time to go into details because it would surely go over my head. In my junior year, he started using me as an alibi, either to get out of some kind of trouble or as an excuse so he could leave and return to his secretive experiments. Every time he'd have me meet somebody, he'd coach me on what to say to them and when to say it. I'm abruptly taken out of my thoughts when the next person in the support group starts talking. I'm only half paying attention. I'm thinking about Borgenson and staring at the same 3 triangles on the floor. I hear her say something about compensation for driving. A slight smile crept over my face when I heard this, because I wished I had that woman's problems. At least Borgenson gave me a truck and refunded me on the gas I used when I drove around, picking up the freshest roadkill I could find. During my senior year, I learned about Professor Borgenson's connections with some people in the school's zoology department. I discovered this when I actually had the official paperwork to pick up the body of howler monkeys and the body of a bonobo ape. I had been in his house a few times, but the first time I was allowed inside was right before the hurricane was about to make landfall. I thought I was called to help him prepare his house for the rain, but instead it was to do something I was not prepared for. It smelled of the same chemicals that I had stolen for him, and a coppery smell that was not unlike the scent of blood. In his upstairs bedroom was a makeshift lab, and in it was the body of a huge and hideous creature, strapped to a table and submerged in ice. It was hard to see the body, but to me it was as though he'd stitched many of them together. Borgenson was in a rush and was in no mood to answer questions. He needed to do this experiment before the storm hit, and since he still had all the blackmail material over my head, I did too. After hours of telling me to flip a switch here or press a button there, the hurricane was right on top of us. I wanted to stop, but Borgenson insisted that we keep at it, and that it was now or never. I was terrified as the gale force wind broke the windows. Borgenson had to yell over it for me to hear his instructions, but eventually he gave this creature a pulse. Since we were on the 2nd floor and the hurricane was tearing the house apart all around us, we had to bring this unconscious body down to the main floor, where Borgenson had converted a small room into a cage. Borgenson and I were barely able to get to the basement by the time the hurricane tore the house apart. As the water rose and the violent sound of wind filled my ears, I prayed that I would get out of this. Borgenson, on the other hand, was only concerned about the thing he had created. When it was all over and the hurricane had passed, we discovered the body of the creature had been crushed and died. There is supportive clapping when the last speaker is done telling their story. I clap along, and when it's the next person's turn to speak, I keep my chin on my chest and return to my thoughts. The next person complains about unpaid wages, but I can't relate to that. Borgenson was many things, but he was not a wage thief, and paid me for everything I'd done. Disgruntled by the loss of his creature, Borgenson left me alone, and I was able to focus on my studies. The rare times I saw him were when I prepared his coffee. It was during one of these times that he told me that since I was a senior and wouldn't be around forever, he was searching for a new assistant. After telling me this, he solemnly shook his head and gave me my last payment with a generous bonus, especially for someone with my financial situation. I couldn't have been happier, not because of the money, but because I was finally free of the man who I learned to hate with every fiber of my being. I would soon graduate and move back to my hometown, where I would spend 10 years repressing the memories of Professor Borgenson. A man in the group who goes by Barry is the next to speak. He complains about his boss calling him into work on pre-approved days off. I feel for him. In a weird way, I can relate. Thought I was done with Borgenson, but then one night a stranger comes to Moe's bar, my place of employment. He seems friendly, and even though he didn't look familiar, I saw something in his eyes that reminded me of what I'd seen in the mirror after a night doing Borgenson's bidding. Once the barflies started making their way out, the stranger confessed that he was the newest assistant to Borgenson, and the only reason he was at the bar was because Borgenson was in town and needed my help. I refused, but when the stranger told me that Borgenson still had the blackmail material, and if I didn't come along, he was going to use it against me, When Barry wraps up his story, everyone claps, and it snaps me out of my memories and returns me to the present. It's my turn to speak. I've been coming to the support group for a long time, but I've never said more than 2 words. After all, what can I say? That if I could, I'd trade my position with any of these people. That they should get on their knees and thank their lucky stars for not having bosses that blackmail them. That Borgensen still forces me to do things for him, like stealing bodies from the morgue. There's only one answer I can come up with. Pass.